Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. You guessed it, shit's about to get real. Cashflow King with you today. And today in episode 36, we're going back to the basics, beginner edition. Before we get into all that, thanks so much for taking the time to listen to the show. We truly appreciate it. We are still in 25 countries and hopefully still counting. We don't have any new ones to give any shout outs to. However, I do have several individuals that I would like to give a shout out to. So as you may have learned in the last episode with Cube Crusher and Cold Brew, where we talked about pre-tax versus Roth, we announced that we now have the ability for folks to subscribe to the show. And just another reminder and kind of point of distinction, depending on the podcast player that you're using to listen to the show, you can follow the show, you can subscribe to the show in that capacity. That doesn't cost you anything to listen to the show, and we certainly appreciate everybody that follows along with the show and subscribes in that fashion. However, what we did add was a way to financially contribute to and subscribe from a financial standpoint to the show with very, very low amounts, starting as low as $3 a month. It is a relatively new feature that Buzzsprout has launched, so we're testing it out. One of the things, I'm not going to make any concrete promises on today's episode, but I do want everyone to know that we are working on several things in the background here at Real Talk Personal Finance, and once those are solidified, more information will become available and forthcoming at that time. But we are looking to do something specifically and especially for those who decide to become a subscriber of the show and make a small financial monthly commitment to supporting the show. Those folks will be in for a treat, hopefully here soon. So along those lines, I want to recognize several folks that have recently subscribed to the show. We gave a shout out last time, but we're going to shout them out one more time because they were our very first 2 subscribers to the show, and that was before we even formally and officially announced it. So big shout out to Rex and Spencer C. I'm not going to say anyone's last name if your last name comes through on here. I'll just say your last initial. So Rex and Spencer C. were the first 2 subscribers to the show. In addition, since then, we have Stephen H., Thomas N., Derek R., Clint T., Casey B., and we don't have a last name or last initial for this one, but Jonesy. So thanks again to Stephen H., Thomas N., Derek R., Clint T., Casey B., and Jonesy for being our newest financial subscribers to the show. Once again, in order to do that, if you're listening to the show in your podcast player, simply go to the show notes, and there should be a link that says something to the effect of click here to help us keep making great content. Once you click on that, there will be a pop-up that comes up on your screen, and you will have the ability to choose whether you want to support the show at a $3, $5, $8, or $10 per month level. And again, we have some things in the works, especially for those subscribers that you guys will be hearing about hopefully in the near future. So with all that said, and without further ado, we're going to get into today's show, which is back to the basics, beginner style. How are your New Year's goals coming along? Anybody make any New Year's goals or New Year's resolutions? Yeah, mine too. So I think sometimes we just need to go back to the basics in different aspects of life. And I recently got back from vacation, so it's been a little while since we put something out. And I've been doing a lot of thinking. I've been listening to a lot of other podcasts. I've been talking to other people. I've been open to feedback from those that listen to the show. And it dawned on me from many different sources that sometimes we all just need to go back to the basics. And for some of you that have been enjoying the show up until this point, maybe you're more an intermediate or advanced type of investor or personal finance connoisseur, that's great. And hopefully this is just a nice quick refresher for you guys. But there's a lot of people I would imagine that are also listening to the show that maybe sometimes we're talking about things and it would be helpful if we just went back to the basics, or we just spent a little time talking about some more elementary things before we get into sort of the more advanced stuff. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity here, sort of at the beginning, coming into the end of February. We're still near the beginning of the year. I know I've had some New Year's resolutions that have gone completely out the fucking window. So I got to get back to the basics on some health stuff from my own personal life. But I think we can all use a refresher on the personal finance angle as well. So that's what we're going to do. This is going to be the first of hopefully several different back to basics shows. Today is going to be the beginner edition. And what I've decided to do is just come up with, for today, I have 5 different mini topics, if you will. This shouldn't be a terribly long episode, but just to really go back to the basics and hit on some things that people should be thinking about and should be doing, possibly before moving on to other elements that we talk about here on the show. Before we jump into those 5, really quick as always, this show is for education and entertainment purposes only. Please seek your own individual professionals for your own individualized advice. Nothing we say on the show constitutes advice, whether that's tax, legal, financial, you name it. We do not give any advice on the show. With that said, let's go ahead and jump in. So the first thing, and I noticed this, especially listening to a lot of different podcasts. We had a pretty long drive coming back from this vacation, and I like to consume other financial podcasts. Hopefully you do as well. And I heard somewhat of a common theme, and it just seems to be sort of America today, quite frankly. And that is folks that might be struggling with certain types of high interest rate debt, specifically credit card debt. And for those of you that have listened to the show for a while, all the way back, I believe it was episode 8, we had the Travel Queen on. With or without her, we'll be doing some other travel hacking related shows in hopefully the near future. I've been doing a little more travel hacking myself as of late, and so I'm really excited about different things that I'm learning in that arena. But even in listening to some of those shows, a lot of the shows out there that focus exclusively on that content, sometimes we'll have people come on there and they talk about how they got started and in a lot of cases how they got burned and how they weren't educated and how they weren't knowledgeable about what it is that they were getting into. They didn't have a plan. They didn't have a strategy. And they kind of just went batshit crazy and got fucked over with credit card debt pretty much. So the first thing I thought would be helpful to put on the Back to Basics Beginner show today was just to talk a little bit about high interest rate debt in general. And that can come in several different forms. I mean, if you have, payday loans, depending on the part of town that you might be in, wherever you live, generally speaking, the more payday loan and cash advance type of places that you see, the lower the income is in that area. And, you may have something there. You may know somebody that has something there, but there's a lot of payday type loan places where, quite frankly, they're just downright predatory, right? So hopefully that's not the folks that are listening to this show. You may also, and as we were driving back from vacation and driving to vacation, we went through some different places, and I noticed this part of the country had several different title loan places where you essentially could pledge the title of your vehicle to get a loan. And then, obviously, if you defaulted or didn't pay that loan, your vehicle is the collateral. You basically lose your car or your SUV or whatever you drive. Also, probably one of the worst types of debt. So if you have payday loans, if you have a title loan and things are not going as planned, this, I hate to say it, even though we're trying to go back to the basics, that is not something I have a ton of experience with. That is not the clientele that I work with in my day job. That is just not something that I'm very knowledgeable about, other than to tell you that, oh my goodness, your hair's on fire, so to speak, and you probably need to talk to somebody ASAP. And there's a lot of shows out there and YouTube channels out there and things like that that focus almost exclusively on those that are kind of in over their head. One of them, I don't like to give or say people's names, and I don't want anybody coming after me for saying somebody's name, but it rhymes with shave and last name might rhyme with Hamzy. So if that's you, you may want to tune into content such as that and hopefully, try to get some assistance and guidance from one of those types of shows that is dealing with that on a regular basis, because there's a lot of work to do. I don't think that's going to be the vast majority of listeners to this show. However, I would imagine that there's a good portion of folks listening to the show that probably have some form of credit card debt. So let's spend a few minutes talking about that. First of all, and if you want to take notes or you choose to give yourself sort of a homework assignment, that's completely up to you. But one thing I would be thinking about first and foremost is simply taking an inventory of what you have going on. Similar to what you would do, with your typical net worth statement or balance sheet. You got your asset, you got your liabilities on the other side. Just simply take an inventory of what do you owe? To whom do you owe it? How much? What's your payment? What's your interest rate? And so on. And just get a good idea of what that looks like. You could literally write it down on a piece of paper. You can use a spreadsheet. There's different ways to do it, but especially with the credit cards, a lot of people may have several different credit cards. You want to know, who do you owe the money to? What are they charging you in interest? What are your payments or your minimum payments? Not that you should just be making that. We'll talk about that in a second. And just get a sense of what that looks like. That's the starting point, because I would venture to guess a lot of people, it doesn't make you or anybody a bad person if this is the case, but they don't want to deal with it. They simply ignore it. It's kind of like me. I'll keep talking about myself a little bit in the health realm. I like to consume a lot of food, and I don't necessarily track it because I know I probably eat more than I should, and I eat way more shit than I should. And if I saw it in black and white on a piece of paper, then there's no refuting that, well, I guess I am doing kind of shitty when it comes to that, right? Whereas if you just kind of ignore it and you eat whatever the fuck you want and you don't write it down and there's no accountability, then, oh, it's not all that bad. And maybe I conveniently forgot about that, fill in the blank, whatever I happen to eat, that I shouldn't have had. So I think the same thing can be said about finances. And so that's one thing that I would suggest is, maybe simply writing down, okay, what does that look like, and getting a handle on that. And then from there, there's several things that you can do. One thing that comes up fairly often is what's called a balance transfer. And some of you may be familiar with this, others, this might be news to you. But there are opportunities, and you got to look around a little bit. Sometimes you might get offers in the mail. Sometimes you might just do an internet search. Sometimes you might call around to your local bank or credit unions. Typically, credit unions are going to be a little bit better for something like this, where they will essentially help you to consolidate that credit card debt with them for hopefully a very low and hopefully 0% for a period of time interest rate. So you may have, for example, 3 different cards that you owe money on that you haven't paid off in full. They're at 3 different interest rates. You could not afford to pay them off right this second, but maybe in a period of 3 months or 6 months or 1 year or whatever the case might be, you feel fairly comfortable that you would be able to go ahead and knock those out. But if you weren't paying such a high interest rate percentage, you might even be able to do that a little bit more quickly. That's where something like a balance transfer might be able to come into play. So you might look around for some offers that say, hey, 0% interest rate for the first 12 months or the first 18 months or whatever it is. Again, you need to do your homework and shop around a little bit and see what's out there before you make any decisions. Now, a lot of times, if you do that and you do make a balance transfer, sometimes there's no charge to do so. But other times, let's say you transfer to a credit union that offers you 0% for 12 months, for example. They might say, okay, well, based on the amount of debt that you're transferring over, we'll give you 0% interest for 12 months. And after that, it's going to jump to whatever the rate is, hopefully nothing overly egregious. But when you transfer that money over here, we're going to charge you, say, a 2% or 3% or whatever the amount of the debt is as a one-time fee. Right? So let's just say, hypothetically speaking, that somebody owed $10,000 of credit card debt, and the institution had a 2% one-time balance transfer fee. So 2% of $10,000 is $200, right? So you might pay a $200 fee to transfer that 10 grand over to, say, a credit union at now a 0% interest rate for a period of time while you knock it out. And you might say, well, that sucks. Why would I voluntarily pay $200? Well, how much would you pay in interest on that $10,000 over the course of a year if you didn't do that and you didn't pay it off, right? That's where it comes back to that little inventory, right? Taking stock of what you owe and who do you owe it to and what's the interest rate. And a lot of times that's actually a better deal to go ahead and do the balance transfer because you're going to save money overall by doing that. The trick or the key here is that, you want to make sure if you do that you are extremely confident, borderline certain that you can go ahead and pay off that balance once it's consolidated by the end of that teaser rate period. So again, if they, as an example, give you 0% for 12 months, you might want to have a plan to pay it off in 10. And that way there, if something happens and you need to take the full 12 months, you can, and you're still not paying interest. But if you think it's going to take you way longer than that, well, after 12 months, you need to understand what is the rate that teaser of 0% is going to jump to. Is it going to go back to 20% like your old card? Is it going to be 7? Is it going to be 11? Like, who knows, right? So you need to find all that information out as you're doing your homework and doing your due diligence. So that's one thing that I would say. I can't tell you the number of people that I've talked to over time that I've heard on podcasts, you name it, that are struggling with credit card debt, and even clients sometimes that I work with in my day job that are trying to put away money for retirement and do some retirement planning, but at the same time they might be struggling with credit card debt. It's really kind of crazy the amount of people that this affects. So I think it's very relevant to have that as part of the Back to Basics beginner show in terms of working on that. So you can approach this in a few different ways, but first and foremost, you might want to take a look at something like a balance transfer opportunity if it exists for you after you shop around a little bit. And then whether that happens or not, let's say it doesn't, or quite frankly, you're too lazy to do it, right? And you say, fuck that. I'm not making the calls. I'm not doing an internet search. I'm playing video games. I'm going out to eat, whatever, right? Just don't put it on your credit card. You can do whatever you want to do, but there's two main methods that a lot of people use to try to dig themselves out. And the first one that's often talked about is what's called a debt avalanche. Again, you've already written this down or typed it up. You know your cards and your interest rates and how much you owe and all that shit. You simply would start with the highest interest rate first. So let's say, going back to the example of you owed money on 3 different cards, and one of them is at, I'm just going to make numbers up, one of them is at 5%, one is at 15%, and one of them is at 22%. You would, regardless of the balance, the outstanding balance and how much you owe, you would start with, in this example, the card that's charging you 22% interest. You would make the minimum payments on all your cards, but then anything extra that you could apply, you would simply apply it to that highest interest rate, in this example, 22%. That mathematically is going to be the best way to pay the least amount of interest over time if you're going to do it this way. But sometimes people need to and like to just see progress, and the mathematically optimal way is not necessarily the best way for them. Sometimes people just want to feel like they're making progress. Well, if that's the case, then you might go with this other method, which is often referred to as what's called the debt snowball, where you simply would start with the lowest dollar amount of outstanding debt that you owed and then continue on from there. So again, if you had 3 different credit cards and you owed 3 different amounts, and you owed, say, I don't know, $500 on the card that I think I said was 5% or something. Let's say you owed, 5% interest, $500 on that card, but you had other cards you owed up to 22% interest on. You would simply make the minimum payment on those and aggressively try to knock out and pay more than the minimum on that $500 card in order to get that taken out of the way more quickly. Now, obviously, by doing this, this is not the mathematically optimal way to do it, but it might kind of put some pep in your step and make you feel like you're making progress, because you're like, you know what, that card's now gone. Yeah, maybe I paid a little bit more interest, but now I only have 2 cards that I owe money on instead of 3, for example. So that's something to consider. The debt avalanche, where mathematically it's the correct choice, where you start with paying more on the highest interest rate. That was the first thing we talked about. Second one is the debt snowball, where you would focus on the card that has the lowest outstanding balance, and you wouldn't focus on the interest rate. You would focus on putting anything extra towards that card. But no matter which method you're choosing, you're still making at least the minimum payment on the other cards. That's essentially how these 2 methods would work. So that's something to think about. A lot of you, that might be old news. Some of you might be rolling your eyes saying, Cash Flow King, I've listened to your other episodes. We don't carry a balance, so on and so forth. Again, I think this is a good review for everybody, so just bear with us as we go through. If you'd like to skip some of the Back to Basics shows, if you think you're some personal finance guru, then be my guest. Go right ahead. Just don't forget to subscribe in case you miss it on a couple of the other intros. But anyway, back to the show. That's category number 1. So high interest rate debt. Okay, and a few ideas on some credit card stuff. We will get back into the travel hacking and talk about credit card rewards and points and miles and all that stuff. But as I've said on other episodes, none of that matters if you're carrying a balance and you're paying interest on credit cards. So first and foremost, back to the basics. It doesn't matter how many times me or anybody else gets on here and talks about how we're travel hacking and doing this and doing that. If you're not able to do so from a position of financial strength where you do not have any credit card debt, then please, please, please don't do that, okay? That's number 1. First part of the show, high interest rate debt with a specific focus on credit card debt. The others will be a little bit faster here as we go through the rest of the show because I don't want to make this overly long. Number 2 is going to be along the same lines, the importance of credit in your credit score. And there's a bunch of different scores out there. You'll hear about Vantage scores and FICO scores and this, that, and the other thing. Generally speaking, you're going to have multiple different credit scores, right? There's going to be 3 different credit bureaus that you can get from each one for free, essentially. And there's all kinds of sites that are going to try to sell you shit, depending on who you bank with and whatnot. Sometimes your bank or credit union might have a relationship with certain bureaus where you'll be able to see certain scores for free. Others you might have to pay for. But you should still be able to get your credit report from each of the 3 credit bureaus once a year for free at annualcreditreport.com. And we're going to go ahead live on the show and just make sure I gave that to you right, because there's so many other sites out there that sound similar. Yeah, here you go. That's what it is. That it sounds similar to that, and I won't name them because I don't want to confuse you, but they actually try to sell you a bunch of shit. But if you go to annualcreditreport.com, you can get your credit report for free. It used to be once a year from each of the 3 bureaus, which is Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. And generally speaking, your score is going to range anywhere from 300 to 850. Some of the different credit scores are slightly different than that, but you want to aim to be at a minimum in the 700s, ideally 720. Some will tell you 740 and above in terms of what you want to shoot for. And in some cases, some of the cards we talk about on the show and some of the travel hacking shit that we talk about on the show, you need to have a fairly high credit score in order to be approved for that. So not only is it good for you to go back to basics and kind of clean things up for your own financial life, but also if you plan to and you thought you heard some of those other episodes, you're like, yeah, that shit's cool. I want to do that someday. I'm just not in a spot to do that now. If that is the ultimate plan, this is kind of a dual whammy, right? You get to clean things up, number 1, and also number 2, you're positioning yourself to more than likely qualify for those cards in the future when you're ready, because you'll be improving your credit score along the way. And your credit score, without going into too much detail, it's made up of several different factors. A few of the big ones, they're going to be looking at on-time payments. So you always want to make sure that you're making your payments on time. If you miss a payment, that is kind of a big deal. Similarly, they're going to be looking at things like what's called your utilization ratio, which is a fancy way of saying how much total credit do I have and how much am I using. Okay, so let's say, for example, I keep using the 3 cards, so let's go back to the 3 card example. Let's say that you have card number 1 and it has a $3,000 limit, and card number 2 also has a $3,000 limit, and card number 3 all of a sudden also has a $3,000 limit. So you have a total of 3 cards, each with a $3,000 limit, for a total of $9,000 of available credit. Well, if you are using more than a third of that, so you could be using all 3 cards at the same time for different reasons, whatever the case might be, but if you're using more than about a third of your credit utilization ratio, so 9,000, a third of that is 3,000. So if you're charging up more than, say, $1,000 on each of those cards at any given time, that's probably about the most that you want to do. Any more than that is going to start to negatively impact your credit score, right? So let's say maybe a better example would be if you had, and this is something that comes up from time to time, let's say you only had 2 cards, right? You have 1 card right now, and that card has a $5,000 credit limit. And then you decide you're going to open up another card for whatever reason, which temporarily, as we'll talk about here in a minute, can ding your score. But let's say that second card all of a sudden now has a $15,000 limit on it. So you went from 1 card at a $5,000 limit, right, to 2 cards. One of them still has that $5,000 limit. The other one has a $15,000 limit. So now your total available credit is $5,000 plus $15,000, which equals $20,000 of available credit, okay? Let's say that you were used to charging up $2,000, right, on the card that had the $5,000 limit, your first card. Well, $2,000 charged when that statement closes over your $5,000 limit, that's a 40% utilization ratio. It's probably a little bit too high, okay? Now, when you open that second card, assuming your spending habits haven't changed, now you have the $5,000 limit from the first card plus the $15,000 limit from the second card for a total limit of $20,000. If you're charging up that same $2,000 when those statements close, but you have $20,000 of available credit in total between those 2 cards, you're only using 10% of your available credit. So now your credit utilization ratio is not 40%, but it's 10%. And that actually is good for your score. So even though when you apply for that second card, there's some people that are screaming at their fucking phone right now, yes, dumbass, I know that it will temporarily drag your score down. There's going to be a hard pull or a hard inquiry on your score. That's one of the things, among others, like your length of credit history and the oldest card you have and average credit history and all that crap that will influence your score. Yes, I am aware of that. But the vast majority of your score, about 2/3 of it, are going to be comprised of, number one, making on-time payments, and number two, your utilization ratio. So yes, it could temporarily ding you just a smidge, but then end up helping you in the long run because it increases the amount of available credit that you have, which therefore decreases, assuming you're spending the same amount of money, your utilization ratio, which therefore boosts or helps to boost your credit score for the long term. So hopefully that made sense. If not, or if I went too fast at the end, please feel free to rewind that and listen to that part again. But that's really important and something that not a lot of people are thinking about, not a lot of people really know about or even are aware of how that's calculated. So I think that's important to know. And then the last thing I want to say about just the importance of credit and credit scores, and this might not come as a surprise to everybody or anybody, but anything from as simple as wanting to rent an apartment to wanting to buy a home, to buy a vehicle, whatever the case might be, your credit score does matter and it is important. In fact, I pulled an article, a 2022 article from NerdWallet, and they had quoted a few different things in here based on a survey on interest rates that was gathered by an organization called Informa Research Services. And they said that somebody with FICO scores in the 620 range, so again, that's lower than we're targeting, would pay about $65,000 more on a $200,000 mortgage than somebody that had a FICO score of over 760. That was one bullet point. I'll read you two more. Second one, they said on a 5-year, $30,000 auto loan, the borrower with lower scores would pay approximately $5,100 more over the life of that loan. And then finally, a 15-year home equity loan of $50,000 would cost a low scorer $22,500 more than someone with high scores. And they don't specifically and definitively define what that is in those last two examples, but I would imagine that the range of scores and the difference between those scores would be fairly similar to the first bullet point, which was somebody with a 620 score, which isn't really that great, versus somebody with a 760 score, which most would consider to be excellent or approaching excellent. So very important that you are aware of why and how this shit matters in terms of the Back to the Basics show. So those are the first two. Number one, high interest rate debt. We focused on credit cards because that's where it's going to come into play for most people. Number two, the importance of credit and your credit score. We talked a little bit about that. Next, number three, which is disability insurance. And I can tell you, this is something that nobody really thinks about and very few people talk about, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but there are different types of disability insurance. For most people, if you have an employer and you work for an organization, hopefully they are offering you some sort of disability insurance coverage. Now, a lot of times you can pay for that right out of your paycheck through payroll, okay? Now, as far as that goes, you are going to have access to typically short-term disability, which, as the name implies, or specifically states, is generally going to cover you over a shorter period of time. And then you're also, more importantly, in my opinion, going to have access to long-term disability. Now, your employer, depending on where you work, may provide this for you. They may provide a certain amount for you. And sometimes they will give you an option to buy up or buy more, depending on, what your earnings are and how much coverage they're providing for their employees, assuming that they're doing that. You typically want to have, the general rule of thumb is that you should have disability income insurance to replace approximately 60% of your gross income. And 60% of your gross income before any of your deductions and withholdings and whatnot should be pretty close to your take-home pay. Again, it's going to vary based on what you have going on and what you have coming out of your check. Do you have extra tax withholdings? Are you doing big retirement contributions? Are your benefits shitty and expensive? Are your benefits great and basically cost you next to nothing? So on and so forth. But generally speaking, for most people, about 60% of your gross pay is what you should be targeting for disability insurance. And believe it or not, it is more common for somebody to become disabled, long-term disabled, than it is for them to die. And we're going to talk about life insurance next briefly, but disability insurance is something that not a lot of people are thinking about, not a lot of people are talking about. It can be in certain situations fairly expensive, but it's probably one of the best and most important insurances that you could have. So if you have it available through your workplace, I would strongly encourage you to look into that. And it's going to depend on a whole number of factors. Again, we're not going to go into a ton of depth on this other than figure out if you have any. Figure out if you're working for somebody else, if they offer it. And if you don't have any, or you're not working for an organization that offers it, or you're self-employed or a small business owner, you may have to or want to or choose to go out and get it on your own. Depending on the structure of your organization, let's say you're a small business and you have several employees, a lot of times there are group type of plans where you could have as few as, I believe, 3 individuals at your workplace that sign up for it, and you could significantly reduce your premiums by doing so. I know somebody a long time ago that worked at a dental practice and they did not have disability insurance there, but they were able to get a group disability insurance contract as long as they and 2 of their coworkers were willing to sign up for it. So it is definitely something worth looking into as far as that goes with disability insurance. For those that are extremely high income earners or have a special type of occupation, maybe you're a surgeon or an athlete, professional athlete, or something like that, you want to look into things like, own occupation versus any occupation. We don't have time to get into all that today. Just make sure you're taking a close look at it and you are talking with somebody that deals specifically in that space and can help guide you through and walk you through the best type of coverage for you and your situation. That's number 3, disability insurance. Number 4, we have life insurance. And again, this is something that if you're working for an organization, you probably have some level of coverage through your employer. Some employers will give you nothing. Some of them will give you $20,000. Some of them will give you 1 times your salary up to $50,000, which is very common. But a lot of them will also allow you to buy additional. And most of the time, you can do that in terms of multiples of salary. So let's say somebody's making $50,000 a year. They might get 1 times their salary capped at $50,000, but they might have the ability or opportunity to purchase additional, let's say up to 5x their salary, or I've seen it as high as 9x their salary. So if that person's making $50,000, then maybe they'll let them buy, for example, up to 9x, which would be an additional $450,000 plus the $50 they give them for a total of $500,000. When it comes to life insurance, the best thing I can tell you is to try to do a needs analysis, and there's going to be a lot of similarities between life insurance and disability in terms of taking a look at your own personal balance sheet and your assets. Do you have savings? Do you have investments? Do you have other income sources? What does that look like for you? If you're retired and you have a pension and you have Social Security and you have a couple $1 million in retirement accounts, well, you probably don't need disability insurance. But if you're a 20-something with a young family and you're the primary breadwinner of that family and you want to be able to provide for them and you don't have a lot of savings and you don't have a lot of investments and you have decades until retirement, you better get some fucking disability insurance. Not advice, just my opinion. Strong opinion, if you can't tell. So those are some things to be looking at. And there's some similar concept to the life insurance conversation, although life insurance, as I talked about on, I think I did at least 1, if not 2 life insurance episodes where we talked in detail. So I would point you back to that if you want to get into the weeds on some stuff with life insurance. But for what we're talking about here today, it's more of a protection-based vehicle as opposed to a wealth transfer, long-term care, chronic illness type of thing, which typically comes down the road. What I'm talking about is making sure that you and your dependents, your loved ones, are protected in the event your income stops because something crazy happens to you. You get hit by a bus and boom, you're fucking gone. What are they going to do from a financial standpoint? What types of things do you want to make sure are taken care of for them? Do you have a mortgage, and is it important to you to have that paid off? Well, maybe not if you listen to the Power of Your Mortgage show, but maybe so because you don't give a shit about that show and you have to do what's right for you based on your own emotion, right? Personal finance. So maybe that's important to you. Maybe you have kids, maybe you don't. Maybe you want to take care of college for the children, and that's important to you. So you want to have that accounted for. Maybe that individual that we're talking about having insurance, sorry, my alarm's going off in the background here. Maybe the person that is buying the insurance makes a significant income and they're planning to work for another 30 years, but if they're gone, that income suddenly goes away. Well, how do we replace that income, right? Well, let's say they were contributing to different things and putting money into retirement accounts, and then they had tax withholdings, and they're living on half of that, or their take home is half of that, or even 2/3 of that, or 60%, like we were talking about for the disability insurance example, right? It's going to depend and be different for everybody's situation. But what happens when you take that income stream away for the next, say, 30 years? What does that look like? That needs to be part of the calculation when you're doing this needs analysis. And it's not simply taking, well, so-and-so makes $100,000 and their take-home pay, if we're going off of 60%, is $60,000. And therefore, we're going to take 60,000 times 30, and that comes out to, if I'm doing my math right, what is that, 1.8 million. That may or may not be the number. More than likely, it's not the number, because we have to do what's called a time value of money calculation. I don't expect you as the listener to do that. Unless you're a geek like me, then bust out the financial calculator and have at it. But you should be hopefully working with a professional that understands that, can look at your situation, have a conversation with you, figure out, okay, what are the lump sum things that you want to kill, no pun intended, if something happens, right? What are the things you want gone? And then what's the income you're trying to replace, and how many more years are you expecting that income to be there? Are you going to retire in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and so on? And then we make some simple assumptions about rates of return. Well, if we had some money fall out of the fucking sky and we invested it, and we earned on average X%, whatever that is for you based on your own situation and risk tolerance and so on, what number needs to fall out of the sky today to generate that income stream for that time period? Again, that's not a calculation I expect you to be able to do, but you hopefully are working with a professional that can help guide you through that process, because that's going to help you determine how much life insurance you need. Just be careful that you're not going to, no offense to anybody that's in this space, but typically your local agent that does your auto insurance or your homeowner's insurance, sometimes they have some good stuff, sometimes they don't. But most people that sell insurance, they're living and working for commissions. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. We earn commissions in our field. However, you want to make sure that person really does have your best interest at heart, and they're not selling you some bullshit that you may not need. Because the numbers can get very large, and a lot of people get afraid of that. Oh my goodness, $2 million? There's no way I need a $2 million policy. Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you need a $2 million term life policy, level term, versus a $2 million whole life policy or universal life policy or some other form of permanent insurance that may not be doing for you what you want it to do. Everyone's situation's different. Just be careful. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, please go back and listen to the show that I did previously on life insurance, where we do a little bit more of a deep dive. But suffice it to say, for number 4 on life insurance, the biggest thing I see is you got people that are like, hey, I'm married, I got 2 to 3 kids, don't worry, I have $50,000 of life insurance through my work. No, I don't want to buy anymore because I'm a fucking cheap ass. Can I bump up my contributions by $100 a month into this retirement account? And oh, by the way, we have no money, we have no savings, we have a huge mortgage, we want to send our kids to private school, and we don't have any other assets in place of significant value. Well, the answer is fuck you. No, you're not going to put $100 more into this retirement account. Let's do a friggin' needs analysis and see how much you actually need and get the protection in place. Let's go, as the show title is here, back to basics first. Let's square that away, and then let's talk about other things like bumping up your retirement contributions and things like that. And, I'm halfway being facetious here, right? I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but I see this shit happen all the time, where people think they're doing the right thing. It's like, well, what investment do I pick? And should I put this % here or that % there? And at the end of the day, they're putting in negligible amounts of money that will make no material impact. It's like you could put your money in fucking cow manure. Kind of digress here. But the point is, let's take care of the basics first, right? Back to basics. First things first. Let's get the protection in place first. Let's knock out those high interest rate debts. Let's take care of our credit and make sure that we protect it, because it's going to help us down the line throughout our financial lives. Let's make sure we're protecting ourselves and our family with disability insurance, right? Disability income insurance. Let's make sure that we are protecting loved ones with some life insurance, preferably term life insurance. And then once we do that, and one other thing that I'm going to mention here in a minute, when we get into some of the intermediate and advanced stuff, yeah, go wild. Let's talk about optimizing investments and, Roth stuff and real estate and whatever. Fine. But let's do this shit first. It's not sexy. It doesn't have the sizzle. It's boring as hell. Hopefully I'm making this a little bit more palatable for everybody by joking around and cutting up a little bit. But seriously, these are the basics that we need to take care of first. That leads us to number 5, the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is cash reserves. And some people will talk about emergency funds. We, I believe, did a whole show. I believe it's titled What Level is Your Emergency Fund? And I think there might have been one other show on it too. Go back in the archives. We're on episode, I believe, 36 now. So I don't have all the episode numbers memorized, but feel free to go back. The shows are titled and you can check it out. But basically, it's going to be different for everybody. It's a very personal decision. Everybody wants a number. Everybody wants to hit the easy button. Just tell me what to do, right? Well, let's try to tell you how to think and how to analyze your situation and help you make your own decision. We're not going to tell you specifically and definitively this is what you absolutely must do. However, for those that want that, here we go. I would say you want to look at your situation. Are you single or are you with somebody, whether you're married or not? Are you a one-income household? Are you a multiple-income household? Is your job safe and secure and you're going to be there forever? Maybe you have tenure or something. Okay, great. Do you work on commission where you could be cut the next day? Okay, that's a little bit different. What are your bills and expenses like? Do you have really high expenses? Do you have really low expenses? Is there a lot of fluff in your budget? Are you running around doing a lot of shit that you could cut out if you had to? Or are you pretty much, nose to the grindstone and there's really not a lot of fluff in there? We spend what we spend and, there's really not a lot of cutting back. There's a lot of things that you need to be thinking about when it comes to your life situation, which will help you back into this cash reserve / emergency fund that's right for you. Now, I'll try to make this a little bit personal, and I may have talked about this in the show before, but when I look at my real estate investments, and we're not talking about that on today's show because it's back to basics, but when I look at that and I look at the rentals, that's a business, and I run it like a business, and my cash reserves in that area are significantly more than what I would keep in my personal life. In my personal life, you could also look at it, I guess, kind of like a business, but not really. But you're looking at what are the different layers. We used to do a sheet called layers of protection. If something happens, if there's a job loss, if World War III happens, whatever, what layers of protection do we have? Where do we go? In what order do we go there? And where can we pull from, right? Without penalties and taxes and all that shit. And so depending on what that looks like for you, if your answer is, hey, I'm just getting started, dumbass, that's why I'm listening to the Back to Basics show, Cash Flow King, right? If that's what you're saying, hey, great, awesome, you're in the right place. But your number in terms of runway needs to be a little bit more than likely, right? You need to have a little bit more cash reserve, a little bit more of an emergency fund with the next person that might say, hey, I got this big-ass brokerage account that's not for any designated purpose that I can touch at any point in time. I don't need to have X number of months or years or whatever in emergency funds. I can just pull from my investments even if they're down 50%. Okay, fine. That's great. That person's in a different situation. All right. And then the overlap or the overlay to this whole thing is, how do you personally feel? You might be the person that has places to pull from, but also can't sleep at night if your checking account is below a certain number. And that's going to be different for everybody. So on the very, very low end, for most people, and we're talking about, when I talk about emergency funds or cash reserves, I'm generally talking about months of expenses, living expenses that are essentially bare bones. I'm not talking about your dining out unless you're not going to be able to cut that, or your travel unless you're unwilling to cut that. Things that you must have money for: rent, mortgage, car payment, groceries, utilities, insurances, whatever. Okay? Those things, if you are fairly comfortable in your job situation or employment situation or small business situation, whatever the case might be, then in your multiple income household, or you're just fairly confident and it doesn't really bother you, I'd say at an absolute minimum, and I would not go below this, you're looking at 3 months of living expenses that you need to have ready to go, put somewhere, hopefully in some sort of a high yield savings account, which maybe we'll touch on here in a minute. I'm getting a little bit longer on this episode than I wanted to, but maybe you'll do something like that, okay? For those of you that are maybe a one-income household, or you work in corporate America, or you work for a small business that's not doing too well, or you're worried about your income in some way, shape, or form, you probably want to extend that. I think 6 months of basic living expenses is pretty solid for most people. If you're really worried about it if you're a small business owner and you're the only income stream and you have some seasonality and fluctuations in your income, well, you might want 9 to 12 months. I know people that have 1 year, 12 months of living expenses. For the vast majority of people, 6 months plus or minus 3 months is probably fine. So if you're like, I am nowhere fucking close to that, start with 3. See how that feels. And once you get there, maybe you push it to 4 or 5. You don't necessarily have to get to 6. Maybe you're already at 6 and you're freaking out and you can't sleep at night. Okay, maybe you want to push it a little bit. Go to 9. Maybe then go to 10. If you have to, go to 12. Whatever the number is for you, as far as that goes. But when we did the CFP curriculum, Certified Financial Planner curriculum, one of the things that they talk about in there, they had a high point of 24 months, which I think for most people in their personal life is absurd. I think 12 on the high end is more than adequate, especially if after that point you're building other assets and investments, specifically those that are accessible to you that are outside of a retirement plan. Then I think you need to worry about it less and less, and you can get by with having a little bit less as long as you're still comfortable with it. So that is number 5 on cash reserves and emergency funds. The last thing I'll say, and we'll close out the episode, you might be thinking, well, where do I keep that? Well, you can keep that in some sort of high-yield savings account if you want to. That's one place. Some people do CDs. Some people do short-term investments. We're not going to get into that on today's show. But a high-yield savings account, if you simply Google that, you can link it to your existing bank account. So maybe you bank at a big-ass brick-and-mortar bank, or maybe you bank with a little credit union or whatever, and they're paying you pretty much peanuts, if anything, in interest. And you're like, well, this is bullshit. I hear rates are going up. My savings or checking account is barely earning anything. Where can I get a little bit more interest? Something as simple as a high yield account, which is typically going to be with some sort of an online bank. There's a bunch of them out there. Make sure they're FDIC insured and all that good stuff. But if you simply Google high yield savings, you'll find a bunch of them. Today is February 19th, so in today's interest rate environment, we're typically seeing rates anywhere from 3.5%. I've seen them at 4%, give or take a little bit. Rates seem to be on the rise as of late, and that may very well continue, so those rates could climb a little bit. When rates were significantly lower a year ago, the rates on those accounts were significantly lower, but in almost all cases, it's going to be significantly more than you're getting at your local institution. It's not a retire tomorrow, get rich quick type of thing, but you will earn a little bit more interest. You simply open an account with one of those institutions once you've checked them out and they meet your criteria. A lot of them will have no fees, no minimums. You simply link it to your existing account, and then you can transfer some money over into that online high-yield savings account and just let it sit there. And if and when you need it, hopefully for an emergency, right? If this is for your emergency fund, usually you can transfer it back into your original bank account in usually 2 to 3 business days, sometimes same day, depending on the institution. So feel free to check that out. Always make sure before you go transferring money around from your existing institution to a high-yield savings, if you decide to do so, that you make sure you maintain whatever minimum balances might be required by that original institution. So the last thing you want to do is leave $1 in there and transfer all your money to a high-yield savings account to get a better interest rate, and then just get smacked in the face with fees from the first bank because you let it drop below their minimum balance threshold. So keep that in mind. I think that's all we have today on the Back to Basics beginner episode. So just a quick recap. We talked about high interest rate debt, specifically credit cards. We talked about the importance of credit in your credit score. We took a look at disability insurance, life insurance, and then finally cash reserves and emergency funds. So thanks again for tuning into the show. This is the first of hopefully several episodes in the Back to Basics mini-series. Today is going to be the beginner episode. Special shout out again to all of our subscribers, which at the moment I can read them all because there's not that many. We have Rex, Spencer C, Stephen H, Thomas N, Derek R, Clint T, Casey B, and Jonesy. Thank you very much for subscribing to the show. To all the listeners out there, if you feel like we are adding value to your life and you'd like to help support the show financially for as low as $3 a month, feel free to use the link in the show notes. It says click here to help us keep making great content, and also be on the lookout for some things we're going to hopefully be getting off the ground here relatively soon. I don't want to spill the beans just yet, so I want to wait till we have some things firmed up a little bit more, but be on the lookout for that in future episodes. That's all we have for today. We will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.